don't need to stand. Okay. Well, friends, neighbors, distinguished guests, good evening, and welcome to Christ Church, Elbow Park, as we present this public lecture on the important issue of the housing crisis facing our country and our city. Before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I want to acknowledge an important dignitary in our midst, MLA for Calgary Elbow, Samir Kayandi. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for your interest in this very important issue and for your commitment to working towards meaningful solutions to these complex but not insurmountable challenges. It's becoming more and more common, as I'm sure you're aware, at these kinds of events that we make a land acknowledgement. And I think nothing could be more appropriate on a night when we're talking about housing, something that is so intrinsically connected to the land, to place, and to peoples. So in the spirit of reconciliation and hope for a good future for all who live in this land now and all who will live in it after we are long gone, we acknowledge that the Creator has journeyed with many peoples on this good land before it was called Calgary or Alberta or Canada. Here where we are, we acknowledge the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Nakota Nations, and the Métis government, Districts 5 and 6. And we acknowledge that the Creator journeys with us now as we seek a good way forward together on this land, where we live and move and have our being. Well, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Gregor Craigie. Gregor has been a journalist for more than 25 years, currently working as radio host for CBC Victoria. Gregor's work in journalism has taken him all over the world, but tonight he comes home because Gregor grew up here in Elbow Park and here at Christ Church. Gregor's recent book, Our Crumbling Foundation, How We Solve Canada's Housing Crisis, will be available for purchase, and I will mention that at least once or twice more before the night is out, after he gives a talk and after we have a Q&A. And thanks to our friends at Owl's Nest Books for providing those books and being here. Support local. Our Crumbling Foundation combines data and real stories of real Canadians to paint a picture of some of the causes of our current crisis. And it holds up some solutions that have been discovered in other countries. Solutions like housing co-ops in Germany, 3D printed houses in Mexico, which I'll tell you, my 10-year-old got very excited about, and key worker housing in London, just to name a few examples. And these give us a variety of models to learn from, to find what works here in our context. But I should really let him speak for himself. It's a dangerous thing, giving a priest a microphone. We have a tendency to preach. Gregor will speak for a little bit, and then we'll have time for question and answer. And after the question and answer, a chance to stay for a reception in the Crump Room and carry on the conversation in a more intimate face-to-face way. So if you haven't already, please silence your phones. Note that this talk is being recorded and will be put up on our YouTube channel in the coming days for you to return to and to share with friends. Well, I think that's enough from me. Would you please join me in welcoming Gregor Craigie?
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you very much. I'm going to use the full extent of this microphone stand. The current, and who knows for how much longer, Premier of British Columbia, who works in Victoria where I live, is 3 inches taller than me. He's 6'8". Tall enough and far enough away from some of his cabinet colleagues that they built him a special rising and declining podium. And I have to admit, I had some serious podium envy the first time I saw that, going up and down. And just one final housekeeping note. If anyone has come here expecting dodgeball assassination, looking for the youth group, they're in the lower hall. But I gather, having heard Brandon's introduction, you'll be ready for a talk on housing. And I'm sad to be coming here talking with this bad news topic in mind. I've been talking in a number of provinces over the last 6 months, and I felt a bit like a roving dark storm cloud on an otherwise blue, sunny day when people have lots of other things they could discuss. I know you could be anywhere else on a Friday night, so thank you very much for coming to discuss, not just listen to me, this very important topic. It's really nice to be back here in Calgary, the city I grew up in Elbow Park, the neighborhood I lived in for 8 years as a boy, and in Christchurch, where I used to sing in the boys' choir. And it feels like home, in the truest sense of the word, even though I haven't lived here for decades. When I came to the neighborhood an hour or so ago, I remembered Sunday morning waking up to the peal of bells from Christchurch, walking in the snow to play hockey on the rink just across the road, playing cops and robbers, capture the flags in the bushes over there, and walking to school every day. I love this neighborhood, and I'm happy to see it looking so nicely. It's all indelibly impressed of me, and it all speaks to me of home. So I understand why so many people love this neighborhood. They love this city. And I understand that people feel similarly for a lot of neighborhoods where they feel at home, where I can say I feel at home now in Oak Bay in Victoria. It's a neighborhood that reminds me a lot of Elbow Park in a different setting. There's old homes, lots of old trees. It feels lived in. It feels like a neighborhood. It feels like a place you want to call home and stay maybe for the rest of your life. One of the many things I love about it is the character and the fact that, frankly, it's old. It doesn't feel like it's changing every few minutes. But as a journalist who travels and writes books and pays a lot of attention to the world around him, I can't ignore the fact that while my neighborhood in Victoria has stayed largely the same, in fact, it's decreased in population in the last census, the world around it, the city around it, this country is changing in huge ways. And yet it's stayed the same for decades, while everything else has been changing, growing significantly. Now, I am a 15-minute bike ride, lucky me, from downtown Victoria. But if I veer just a few blocks away, along a different leafy block, I can come along a road called Pandora Avenue in downtown Victoria, where homelessness has become a crisis. Tents and tarps and shopping carts and discarded needles abound. People struggling through mental health crises, addiction, and other unseen challenges. And as the host of the CBC Radio Morning Show for 17 years, I have spent countless hours and days down there interviewing people from all walks of life, including many who were homeless. And at first, 17 years ago, people would tell me they were on the streets because of a mental health crises or addiction or something of the likes. But more and more, people are saying it started for simple economic reasons. They were evicted and they could no longer find a place to live. And I'm hearing that from more and more people, street nurses, housing outreach workers, more and more people saying it's more often than not now, in this city anyway, an economic impetus, an economic trigger that has people sleeping out in tents and in their cars and so on. And often what's happening after that is that addiction and mental health challenges that were under control or unknown to the person are surfacing. All the while the situation has been getting more difficult in housing, I've been working this early morning shift, as I said, for 17 years, waking up at 3:45 every morning to start work at 4:30, broadcasting live for 3 hours at 5:30. It's a great job, but it's less than ideal from a sleep standpoint in life, as you can imagine. And perhaps as a way of coping with the sleep deprivation, I started writing a novel. I hoped it would be a comic novel several years ago about a sleep-deprived radio host called Radio Jet Lag at a fictitious Victoria news talk radio station called CIFU. And as I was describing the sleep deprivations and behind-the-scenes antics at a fictitious news talk radio station that can make live radio a medium unlike anything else, I was surprised to see the plot change and veer right through a homeless camp. Now, this was a work of fiction, but the homeless camp that entered the book was a real-life encampment on the lawn of the provincial courthouse, just a few blocks from the BC legislature, and right across the road from the imposing Gothic Anglican cathedral in Victoria. And although homelessness wasn't part of my original outline, it soon imposed itself on the plot. And at first I wondered why, and then it quickly enough became apparent to me. Homelessness, encampments are a part of city life in Victoria and more towns and cities across this country. It's become part of our story. It's tragic, but it's true. Once I'd finished writing the novel, I was compelled to turn my attention back to nonfiction and housing in particular, and the question, how did it all go so wrong? How did the average cost of a house in Canada jump 365% between 2001 and 2021, while the cost of everything else went up only 43%? One of the rules of radio is don't overwhelm people with numbers, so I will quote very few numbers tonight, but I just want you to remember those numbers. From 2001 to 2021, the average cost of a house went up 365%, while everything else went up 43%. How did our biggest cities become simply too expensive for some of our most essential workers? How did owning a home become a dream that more and more young Canadians say they'll never realize? And how did so many of our fellow citizens end up sleeping in vans, RVs, cars, or tents? And most importantly, what can we do about it now? A person's home really is the foundation of their life. It doesn't take the place of family or love or who you are as a person, of course, but from a practical point of view, it is the bedrock of your life. But what happens if you don't know how long you'll have it? What if you're losing sleep every night, having panic attacks, worrying you're going to be evicted, and that you won't be able to find a new rental home that you can afford? I've lost track of the number of people who've told me this story, people with pensions who've worked a whole lifetime and are now terrified because it happened to their friend. What if you find yourself in that position and you're living in an old car or a van or a tent? When people don't have a secure foundation, the rest of their lives, of course, are almost always destabilized. And as more and more of us have our lives destabilized because of the lack of a secure home, the more our communities are destabilized, our whole cities are destabilized, and our whole country is. Canada's housing crisis is not going to get better unless we make a number of significant changes. At the end of this book, where admittedly I talk a lot about problems, I also discuss solutions and offer dozens of repairs, of remedies that might try to make things better. It's a list of repairs, and it is a long one. I know all too well that some of the actions, by the way, in the list that might work in Vancouver or Toronto wouldn't necessarily work in Calgary. Communities have to figure these things out for themselves. But make no mistake, we need change. We can rebuild the stable foundation of affordable housing, but change is needed. Before I talk about that change, though, and what might be done, I want to just review how serious the crisis has become and how it's happened. To start, Canada does not have enough homes, and that is putting it mildly. CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, estimates that by the end of this decade, after the extra 2.3 million homes that are forecast to be built, we will have a deficit of 3.5 million homes. That's smaller than the forecast deficit in the United States, with more than 8 times our population. 3.5 million homes shy. The result of that scarcity, of course, is predictable. Costs go up and up and up to purchase or to rent. Now, housing affordability has been an issue for some people in some communities for decades, of course. But what's new is the scale, the widespread scale of the problem. Canada's first federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle, put it bluntly a couple of years ago when I talked to her. Housing and housing affordability, she said, is becoming more and more out of reach for most Canadians. Most are young and employed. Many are educated, but those things don't mean what they used to for many. The old rule that going to school and getting a good job would let you buy a home simply doesn't apply for many young Canadians anymore. So how did it get this bad? Well, if there's a long list of repairs, there's also a long list of factors that brought us here. For one thing, the federal government largely gave up on building social housing 30 years ago. There were reasons for it, financial reasons, and arguably good reasons to start. But make no mistake, it's had very human consequences over the decades. But there are many, many other reasons, like decades of low interest rates that encouraged millions of people to invest their money in housing as a commodity and essentially commodified a lot of our housing supply. Then along came short-term vacation rentals, first referred to as home sharing. I took my 3 kids to Montreal a few years ago and stayed in a lovely neighborhood, Le Plateau, in this lovely walk-up apartment because I couldn't get a hotel room for a family of 5. And it took me about half an hour for it to dawn on me, this was somebody's home. Until just a few months ago. It no longer is. David Walksmith at McGill University tried to quantify this with the data he could get from the companies and found thousands of homes were taken out of the housing supply to be turned into Airbnb. And I'm guilty. I've booked them. I've stayed at them. They were great. But what's the social cost to a community when that happens? On top of all that, we've had record-setting population growth in this country, only exacerbating some of these difficulties. And then, of course, there's the contentious issue of zoning, single-family zoning, where it's relatively simple in a neighborhood like mine, at least it was a few months ago, to obtain a permit to tear down my lovely old home and build a brand new single-family home, as long as it's a single-family home. But if I wanted to replace it with, let's say, a fourplex of roughly the same size, I could be tied up for years trying to get permission. In Greater Victoria, where I live, some municipalities are now speeding things up. But for decades, it's been a slow process. One of the many people I interviewed for this book is a private construction company owner named Luke Mari. He lives in Victoria, and he owns a company called Arise Developments, or he's a partner in it. He is going gangbusters. They are building every type of housing imaginable, at least under 10 stories, but they're frustrated because they can't build more. And his finger points primarily at local municipal halls. He points to a proposal in Saanich, which is a Victoria suburb and the largest municipality on Vancouver Island, where they wanted to build a major affordable housing unit along with market rental housing, mix of affordable and market rentals, right near the Commonwealth Pool, where the 1994 Commonwealth Games were held, right near a major highway, a busy road, transit intersections, shopping malls, and so on. All they needed was rezoning from the municipality. It took 5 years simply to rezone it. And guess how much of the building is affordable now, he said, just before they started construction? 0. So who won in that scenario, he says. He reckons that was average for Saanich, 5 years simply to get a property rezoned. It could be worse. In Oak Bay, where I live, a fittingly named rental property application project named The Quest took 10 years to work its way through Municipal Hall before the final vote was no. This is a major main street with a lot of rental apartment buildings. Despite his frustration, Luke recognizes that city staff working in city halls, they can't control everything. The building code, new stronger seismic provisions on the West Coast, and no responsible planner or inspector can turn a blind eye to laws that are designed to keep people safer, even if engineers privately confide and sometimes publicly that they think they're too onerous. It should also be noted that the City of Victoria has improved multiple rental apartment buildings in the downtown core, both private and public, and if the population wasn't going up, they probably would have made a huge impact on the local market, including the rents that people are paying. But just like in Calgary, the population is soaring. Here in Alberta, by the way, it's forecast to grow 4.6% this year, up from the provincial government's estimate of 3.7% for this year, and higher than what it was 4.1% last year. Over the last 4 years, StatsCan suggests Alberta's population grew 444,000 people in 4 years. That rising population is another significant factor in the housing crisis. After all, Canada's population has grown at a record pace in recent years. We've led the G7 and the OECD in population growth, due primarily to immigration, temporary foreign workers, and international students. Now, this can be a difficult fact to acknowledge, and it needs to be stressed. that Canada's housing crisis is not the fault of immigrants or temporary workers or refugees or international students. These are all people who have come to this country in good faith in the agreement of our country. But the question of whether our country has managed the number of of incoming people with the housing supply is a question that's getting a lot more debate and leading a number of the provincial governments to ask specifically for a formula. BC's housing minister told me that he made that specific request of the federal housing, or pardon me, yes, the federal housing minister and immigration minister. Please work together. You can increase numbers, you can decrease them, you can keep them the same, but please always remember housing. But there are so many other reasons and contributing factors. A book's worth, you might say, and arguably too much for a talk, especially as I want to get to questions and comments from you. But if housing is a right, as so many contend it is, what can be done about it? What changes does this country need to make specifically? The sad truth is there is no silver bullet. This is an incredibly difficult problem to fix. Yes, on one level, it is a problem of supply and demand. That's absolutely true. But you don't have to spend too long in City Hall or the provincial government or the House of Commons or in any kind of federal department office to know that there are so many moving parts here that there are many changes that are needed. There is no silver bullet. Dozens of changes at all levels of government are required. But for all the bad news on housing, there has been some good news in the last year or so. At least there have been real changes that offer the prospect of improving affordability and availability. The federal government has finally, years after pledging to do so, started moving serious money into the construction of affordable housing. Provinces are starting to make requirements, timelines for adding density. But many, many changes are needed, and we would be wise to look around the world at innovations that are creating a lot more housing in cities and countries where they were at a similar point to us, raising their hands in the air and saying, what are we going to do? At the top of the to-do list, I argue, is the expensive and labor-intensive task of building more housing, addressing that 3.5 million home deficit, in particular, building more affordable housing. Now, lest you think that this is a new idea or that this is pushing a new agenda, this is just really returning to the Canada that many of us grew up in. For 4 decades after the Second World War, this country built hundreds of thousands of affordable public housing units. We were going gangbusters, and in the mid-1970s, construction peaked in this country. 1974 and 76 were the years that we built and completed the most number of new housing units. The population in 1974 and 1976, 23 million. Canada now has more than 41 million people, and we're only barely making as many homes as we did back then. And a large reason for that is that we don't build nearly as many public affordable housing units. If you put that on a per capita basis, it's much worse. So we need to build more housing. If you look at figures and compare Canada to other OECD countries, we're now barely half of the OECD average for the share of our housing that is now affordable public housing. Also high on the list of repairs is the need to build more co-op housing. Co-ops have been around for decades and decades, but we could use an awful lot more of them. People who live in co-ops are not tenants, they're members of a cooperative, and together they're responsible for the home they share. They're not perfect, but time and again, co-ops provide people with stable, affordable homes where they can stay for decades. Now, many people who've lived in co-ops and live in co-ops tell me quite quickly, co-ops are not for everyone. Many networks, in fact, make a point before a person moves in to sharing some key questions people should ask themselves before deciding to join. What balance between privacy and community do I need to be happy? Am I willing and capable of accepting disagreement with my close neighbors? And how will I feel when I'm not allowed to do things I want to do? The answers to the question may lead a lot of people to say, no, Co-ops are not for me. But 250,000 Canadians live in them, and I wonder why that number isn't much, much higher. If we had continued on the trajectory of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s of building housing co-ops, we'd probably have over 1 million people in housing co-ops. I compared Canada to Germany, where millions of Germans live in housing cooperatives. And about 5% of the housing stock in that country is owned by co-ops. That means more than 5 million Germans live in co-op units. And in a time of rents in rental apartments skyrocketing in some German cities, Germans and co-ops say the same thing. It's stable, it's cheap, and I'm not worried I'm going to be evicted. So we could try to copy Germany, where co-op housing makes up 5% of the country's housing stock. Another key measure is building on public land and retaining vacant public land. If we want to make more affordable housing, we could go a long way by keeping all public land instead of selling off schools when we look at a 5-year growth trajectory of enrollment in a school district, as was done in British Columbia about 15 years ago, and deciding to sell them off. Everybody I've talked to since then has said it was a mistake. Don't sell public land. Think of what it could do in a housing context or a transport context or commercial. One of the measures that's been taken is in the city of Montreal that has recently introduced what is called a right of first refusal. The city now has the right to match a bid on any aging rental property where there's an agreement for sale. So they can come in if, for instance, a real estate investment trust is about to buy an old apartment building and very likely evict tenants so that they can do necessary upgrades to the building, but a nonprofit or a co-op will have the opportunity to buy it instead. But across Canada, many towns and cities have no such provisions, and these buildings are being sold. And many people, like the pensioners I've spoken to, including one I spoke to several months ago, living in a 1998 Dodge Caravan, have been evicted and are doing their best to survive now. And another repair, looking at single-family zoning. That doesn't mean a ban on single-family homes like mine, but municipal governments with growing populations are increasingly considering doing away with single-family zoning. I know I don't need to tell most people in Calgary this can be a contentious issue. I don't know if it will be any comfort for you to know that this is an issue in city after city after city. In Portland, Oregon, they're a few years ahead of us on this. They're starting to see an effect on the local housing market now that they've done away with single-family zoning and allowed fourplexes on every single-family lot. I spoke to housing researcher Michael Anderson, who looked at the data for the first year that multiplexes were allowed, and he was clear. It's not a silver bullet, but it's helping. He counted in the first year an extra 200 to 300 homes in Portland because of the change, a city the size of Calgary. So you can imagine, it's modest. But he said it's not a finish line. Over the long haul, the bigger effect will be felt. As every unit in the city reaches the end of its useful life, under this new law, it's more likely to be replaced with a handful of less expensive, though nice new units. I wanted to hear from more than just a housing researcher. I wanted to hear from somebody who builds homes and owns his own company. So I got in touch with Eric Thompson, who has built himself a great life with a company called Oregon Homeworks. He made an extremely successful venture building lovely, big, single-family homes on old inner-city lots, 3,000 square feet, 3,500 square feet, regularly selling for over $1 million, typically to doctors and lawyers. But when the new changes came in, he realized he couldn't fight it, so he decided to adapt. He was excited by the immediate demand for fourplexes and cottage clusters. Most sold for between $400,000 and $500,000 US, and he is quick to acknowledge that's still not cheap. In fact, it's not affordable for many buyers. But he says it's proven to be attainable for a lot of other people who were not even dreaming about living in those neighborhoods or buying his new homes. People who want established, walkable neighborhoods. He mentions a family, a teacher and a restaurant manager with 2 young kids, who bought a small, detached 2-bedroom home. And he says they're typical of about 2/3 of the buyers of his new homes, either the smaller cottages or the fourplexes. I feel really good about what we're doing, he said. I don't know if we're making a huge difference for the city as a whole, But for the people who buy these houses, we're making a huge difference. Another repair involves making it easier and cheaper for property owners to get their hands on something that might have seemed simple years ago, a building plan. Anyone who's ever tried to do a renovation or build something new knows that it can be a lengthy, expensive process. But some cities are now starting to move to off-the-shelf housing designs for multiplexes, townhomes, garden suites, carriage houses, or accessory dwelling units. They're available to any property owner for free who applies for the building permit. They're pre-approved, they're designed by professional architects, and they can seriously reduce the cost. And if you're worried that they might look like something designed by a city bureaucrat or, I don't know, a writer who thinks he knows how to solve the housing crisis, they're designed, as I say, by professionals, and many have been the results of architectural design competitions with money on the line and an incentive for people to come up with multiple designs. Costs could also be lowered for builders, of course. Every builder I spoke to said this. They said, for instance, why do we pay the same interest rates if we're going to build an affordable apartment complex as if we were building a condo building? That's not always the case, but for many it has been. That's starting to change with federal tax changes of late. Many of us wonder why it took so many years, but there are changes, but many more could be done. If we want an example for how government policies like tax and building quotas and incentives for builders can change a situation on housing in a hurry, we can look at France. I was trying to write a chapter on Austria because for years I'd heard, and I remember visiting Austria, and everybody said Austria is a mecca for renters because more than half of the housing stock in Austria is affordable publicly owned rental housing. But when I phoned a number of Austrian housing experts and housing analysts and regular folk, they all said to me, no, you don't want to write about Austria. You want to write about France. And the reason they said is because Austria has been blessed by history. After the Second World War, reasons that I won't go into now, they were blessed with a huge supply of housing that was protected and became affordable. Paris was an entirely different situation, a sclerotic, anemic construction situation in a massive region where as recently as 2014, they were building in the neighborhood of about 43,000 new housing units a year. The French government, the regional government, and the city governments took major initiatives to change things, and they more than doubled housing construction by 2017. 98,000 new homes were built. International comparables, New York City and London, were averaging about a quarter to as low as a fifth of that in terms of new home construction. Housing analyst Yona Freemark in the US attributes the French change to 4 government policies. First, a concerted effort to build more public housing, an awful lot more. Second, for all levels of government and public agencies to make public land available. They scoured military blocks, old unused train lines, you name it. There was a mandate, and public agencies, local councils, and more found public land that could be used for housing and other uses. Business hubs, metro and train stations, office buildings. The third key change was a series of financial and regulatory incentives that got private developers to do most of the work, lower interest loans, and so on. And the final change Freemark identifies was the decision by the national and regional governments to essentially take control away from municipalities by imposing new construction quotas. Even the wealthiest, most affluent suburbs of the Ile-de-France, the greater Paris region, have to make 25% of their housing affordable, according to the formula. Many aspects of the French example could be copied or at least adapted in other countries. But of course, we all have our different set of circumstances and challenges. I mentioned here in Canada our very quick growth rate, the head of G7 and OECD. It's something that is going to be addressed and have to be addressed as public discussions and debate take place around immigration. And I want to repeat, it's not newcomers' fault, the housing crisis. but we do have to talk about it. One of the people I talked to about this, when I confessed I was shy about talking immigration, is Andy Yan, a professor in Vancouver at Simon Fraser University and their city program. He said, do not shy away from talking about immigration in connection to housing. There's a responsibility to new immigrants, he said, to ensure that coming to Canada remains a viable option that isn't simply a future of indebtedness. One of the reasons that immigration has been such a success story in this country is because for so long, this was a country of opportunity. In the book, I quote the CEO of CIBC Bank who went to Pier 21 in Halifax and recalled nostalgically his family story of his father who escaped Yugoslavia. He was Croatian, made it to Canada in the 1960s and built himself a successful life. And I decided to look at the year and then go back at the look at the StatsCan data. The average cost of a house the year his dad arrived was $15,000. The average income for a family was $5,000. 3 to 1. I know this is a crude calculation. Look at it now across Canada, it's 10 to 1 or worse. In cities like Vancouver, you need more than a full-time job before you even pay taxes to pay for a 2-bedroom apartment. It is no longer a land of opportunity, this country, if people coming here only have a future of indebtedness. I'm going to talk about a few more solutions before I'm quiet and hear your comments. There are many, but one that comes to us from the UK, a country that almost everybody I know from the UK has said to me, are you sure you want to talk about Britain? Because they have a terrible housing crisis themselves. But key worker housing is something that many Canadian institutional employers, hospitals and school boards and so on are now pointing to. The idea is simple, that you offer nurses, firefighters, paramedics, teachers, affordable housing in the community they serve. I spoke to a former Calgary resident about this, Emily Bair, who 20 years ago was a teacher in the East End of London, one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in London. She lived with roommates, as so many young people like myself 20 years ago did in London, because that's how you could afford to. When she became pregnant, she quickly faced a dilemma. She was told she had to leave. It wouldn't fit the house to have a baby, but she couldn't afford anywhere to live on her own. So just before she handed in her notice, one of her colleagues said, hang on a minute, there is a new program called Key Worker Housing, and you need to apply. Within weeks, she was moving in to an affordable school council protected apartment building. She called it a little oasis of loveliness because it was filled with nurses, care aides, firefighters. And she said categorically, that key worker housing is what kept me in London. Otherwise, I would have left. There's no way I would have stayed in London without that key worker flat, she said. Meanwhile, I talked to another former Calgary resident, Nicola Montgomery, who was a nurse here and left a few years ago during the pandemic with her partner and young child to go to Toronto to work in an inner city hospital. She quickly gave up on any notion of not only buying a house or a duplex, but even a 1-bedroom apartment. So expensive was it in Mississauga to rent that she decided there was no future for her in the city. But what really worried her at St. Joe's, the central Toronto hospital where she worked, was that her entire cohort of nurses were priced out of the city in the same way. And she said the thing that shocked her was that so many of them had either stopped working entirely as nurses or stopped working full-time. And the 2 jobs they were all going to make more money to afford to live in Toronto were 1, to work in plastic surgery offices giving Botox, 2, to get their real estate licenses. So what does it say about a city when we lose our most essential workers because of the high cost of housing and the only way they can make ends meet, they decide, is to go and sell more housing? Another repair, as Brandon mentioned, is improved construction methods. We're starting to see more modular, prefabricated, factory-built housing in this country. And frankly, it can't come quickly enough. And no, I don't own a share in any prefab company or anything like that. But apart from reducing noise on the construction site and reducing material waste, it also gets more people, often people who have not traditionally worked in the construction industry, involved. Companies in the UK and Ireland and others have noticed more young mothers are able to get into construction if they're working in a prefabricated housing factory, because the location and the hours are the same day after day after day, rather than going off from one remote construction site to the other. And then there's the newfangled futuristic technology that Brandon's son was taken by, 3D printing of housing. It remains to be seen how much this will help. Make no mistake, it is being used to build homes quickly now in Mexico, in Kenya, in the US. Habitat for Humanity is building homes. And if you've never seen one, they are quite impressive. Imagine two long train tracks running about 50 feet apart and 50 feet in length. And they both have wheels and two towers and a long rail in the middle. And at the top is what looks like a soft serve ice cream cone nozzle. And it's going back and forth over the flat concrete foundation. And based on the 3D plan of the house, it is slowly printing a few inches at a time for 24 hours a day, the walls in concrete of the house. Now they're starting as single family homes. In Mexico, the small 2-bedroom homes are taking approximately 24 hours to print each. The construction crew, once they have the foundation, is 2 people. 24 hours. Now, and of course, plumbers and electricians and so on come in. But even with all of the more labor-intensive parts of the construction process, it's happening much quicker. Dubai and parts of China and elsewhere are experimenting with multi-story apartment buildings from 3D printing. It could reduce costs, it could speed up timelines, and it could help us house more people more quickly. So there are many, many possible solutions. There are bright spots. And even in Alberta, indeed, housing starts are up significantly this year, I need to mention. As of August, they'd increased 44% over last year. In Edmonton, an increase of almost 50%. Here in Calgary, up by about a third. Other communities are making progress as well. Where I live in Victoria, construction is speeding up. Vancouver as well. In Vancouver, the Squamish Nation is building a huge new development just across from False Creek over the Burrard Street Bridge, very near downtown Vancouver. It's called Sanok, and it's on land that the Squamish Nation took decades in court to get back, right in the center of Vancouver. They've won the land back, and they are now going to build thousands of homes in very large towers for thousands of people. And this has been a really contentious project. Not everyone in Vancouver likes it. Many people hate it. But I spoke to Kel Selam, who is the chair of the Squamish Nation Council, and he was unapologetic. He said the bottom line is we have thousands of people who need homes. We need about 1,000 units, he said, for Squamish Nation members. But he said everywhere I look in Vancouver, people are desperate for homes. Both rent and housing prices have become unfair, he told me. No matter what income level your household has, very few households in urban areas are getting a fair deal anymore. And that has affected a whole generation, he said, in terms of the future of who we are as a country, our ability to have a life, have a home, grow our wealth, especially if you come from an impoverished background. We're creating a whole economic class, he said, where one side has property and the other is just locked out. Locked out. Those 2 words describe millions of Canadians perfectly. And it will be up to our political leaders at all levels and those of us who elect them to unlock that door that is slamming shut on so many. Thank you very much. This must be Sean. Sean, I meant to say hello earlier. Sean is very kindly going to moderate. Is that a good segue, Sean?
So we'll be doing a Q&A now. I'll be the moderator. And what I'll do is I'll ask, like they usually do, to have you come up and stand, and then I'll pass the mic. You can ask your question and then go and sit back down. So whoever has a question, feel free to come on up. There's got to be. I mean, it's Friday night, folks.
I'm sorry I was late getting here.
Oh, no
and
problem.
This is a really basic question, and you may have gone over it already. But I'm really interested in your motivation for writing the book and what you really hope will be the outcome.
Thank you for the question. I dedicated the book at the start to everybody whose life is on hold because they cannot find a stable home of their own. And I'm glad I did, but it's really surprised me how many people from across the country have read the book. And that's the one thing, it's funny, the first sentence in the book is what they've pointed out to me writing, saying thank you. And it goes to what I was saying about home, or a stable home being the bedrock of your life. And that's what many people I've talked to have described to me. This feeling of, a fundamental feeling of being destabilized because they don't know how long they'll live. I remember a woman I talked to, and so to answer directly your question, my motivation was genuinely, this has to stop. Admittedly, I have 3 kids, and I was selfishly or familially concerned about them. What will their future hold? And let me acknowledge, my house in Oak Bay is now assessed at $1.7 million. I am lucky. My wife, who's a teacher, and I could never buy it now, but we got in at the right time, and it was nothing other than timing. And so our kids will obviously benefit from some generational wealth. And that is becoming the 2-tier society we're creating in many of Canadian cities, where either your parents have wealth and or property or they don't. And it's an increasingly insurmountable problem. But also societally. I don't know how you guys feel about seeing encampments and people sleeping in vehicles. I am stunned by the number of people who are holding themselves together, bathing and dressing and shaving, who are living in vehicles. It's not just Victoria either. I know, we all talk about Canada being on a tilt, and people of various persuasions ending up on the West Coast, and there's surely some truth to that. But it's not just the weather. I was in Toronto for the launch of this book, and everybody was talking to me about that middle point. I just spoke yesterday to a former deputy housing minister in a province I won't name, and he said that's one of the ones that's shocked us, is that invisible homelessness. We see the tent encampments, we see addiction and so on. What's really shocking to us are the people who are living in their cars. I profiled a nurse in Halifax who has worked her entire life and still works in Halifax, and she lives in a van. And she described to me going to bed in the Walmart parking lot, and the dignified married couple in their aging Toyota Camry or Corolla, and the husband in their 60s or 70s would hold the towel up so she could change in the passenger seat every night. And she said, it breaks your heart. And so it does. And for the last several years, it's felt like it's only getting worse. So why did I write the book? Just hoping more people will talk about it. I am optimistic that the country can make meaningful changes and we can address this, but we certainly need to do more than we have.
Now you've all dressed up. I'm looking at all of you. You all look well. Great. Here we go.
Thank you. You spoke about the 1960s, 70s, and the construction of a lot of social housing and housing in general. I'm just wondering what you think systemically led to that construction of lots of social housing at the time, and what changed systemically, and how, and will your solutions that you offer operate in the long term past the next 20, 30 years? Or is there something else that needs to change underlying?
To be honest, when it comes to avoiding that cycle on a 20 or 30 year pattern when it comes to social housing, I actually don't know. I wonder if we are not going to fix this over the next decade, and who knows, be doomed to repeat it. I remember asking Paul Martin when he had just become finance minister, when I was an eager young university student, about balancing the books and getting rid of Canada's deficit. It was important. I think that was one of the major reasons that social housing and a lot of other social programs went by the wayside. It's also worth remembering that housing had been so successful that housing was cheap. I remember renting a bedroom in West Hillhurst in 1996, just before I left, for $220. And even then, it wasn't a lot of money. I barely had to lift a finger to make rent. And so, I mean, I think that you know, vacancy, population growth, everything got under control, and then the government was motivated. The federal government was motivated by a huge deficit to want to cut back spending, and so, I mean, that is the simple explanation. I am surprised that it has taken 9 years. I asked Justin Trudeau in 2015, because that was a specific campaign promise. We were going to radically increase the construction of public housing. And this is not my opinion, but the parliamentary budget officer wrote not that long ago, a year and a half ago, the federal government has not met those commitments. They're really starting to move now, which looks encouraging, so that may make changes. But I do want to return to co-op housing, because every German I've ever spoken to said, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's just wonderful that you can go to sleep at night and not worry about your housing. It also builds community. So I feel like if we made a major increase in co-op housing, that would help last through the waves of government policy on spending and cutting and so on when it comes to social housing.
Thank you for your talk tonight. So I was listening, I was thinking about, it's really about the sustainability of the city. A city that doesn't have, or can't house its professionals and its tradesmen, to me is a city that's dying.
Well, I agree 100%. And in fact, if I had thought to bring the book up to the lectern with me, I would quote to you from Luke Murray, who is the builder in Victoria. He has a dire prediction for, don't get me wrong, I love Victoria, which is home now, but I have to say, I mean, Calgary, I know you have many challenges, as do most big cities, but you are very functional in many ways. A lot of builders I've spoken to, socially minded builders who are building public housing, he predicts Victoria will become, in his words, a resort community in 10 or 20 years if the trends continue, because he knows this from being an employer as well. He's saying, how do you pay somebody when to start they need $30 or $40 or $50 an hour with, you know, just when you look at the cost of the living wage in the city. So he's quite pessimistic. I'm trying to be optimistic, but you're right. It's the viability and the sustainability of a city. And what is a city if you can't have all of your essential workers and people of all income classes mixing rather than just living, you know, miles away, hours away from the exclusive enclave of the people who are being served or who are lucky enough to have property.
Thank you very much for this. I was introduced earlier. I'm Samir Kayandi. I'm the MLA for this riding. And what you said earlier about elected officials and those who vote for them, you know, it really resonated with me because obviously that's my life. And I don't meet a lot of people who come talk to me and meet me in my office telling me that I want more dense housing in my neighborhood across the street from me.
Yeah.
That's not a typical conversation that I have in my office. And what you said really struck with me is that we've got two paths ahead of us. One is we figure out how to build and how to house everyone, make sure that every Canadian has a home. The second path is that we lock everyone up and we throw them out and we stop bringing people in. And I'm very afraid because the people that I hear from more often are setting us down the second path. And so I guess it's not a question. It's more of like we're in a tough time here, and it's up to us to choose what kind of society we want to live in, who we think counts as Canadian. Thank you.
Thank you, Samir. I agree. And by the way, I know a lot of journalists don't often confess this to politicians, but I have full sympathy, especially at the municipal level, but also at the federal level. Just out of curiosity, has anyone here served on a municipal council or anything like that level? Maybe not. I mean, I don't know, increasingly these days, and I mean this sympathetically, not in a damning way, I don't know why people do it. you get so much grief and such a hard time. And many people are simply trying to serve their community. And one of the problems, as I see it, is what you just said. People don't come saying, yeah, let's densify, let's add more homes to my neighborhood. This is one of the reasons, in my experience, that local elected councillors, municipal officials, are not actually the best people to densify. And so what you see, another place I write about in the book is Japan. At first, I wasn't going to write about Japan because it's been losing population. They have 8.5 million empty homes in Japan. It's staggering. By the way, if you can get on Instagram, I would encourage you to look at the Instagram page, Cheap Houses Japan. It's staggering. You can buy like ski cabins, I mean, in proper running water and everything for $17,000, $20,000. I spoke to a Canadian who was just given a cabin near Sapporo. And it's because, of course, they have not so many people. But where I was going with this, and they've been losing population. So the reason I almost didn't write about it is because Japan, I thought, well, what does it prove if they're going down in population and Canada's going up? But the outlier is Tokyo. And Tokyo has been increasing in population. And yet, Tokyo is dirt cheap. And I spoke to so many Canadians in Japan, and they all said the same thing. I really want to come back, but Canada's too expensive. Japan is cheap. And here's the point when it comes to people not coming and asking their local officials or maybe provincial MLAs for more densification. In Japan, for all sorts of reasons that I won't get into, essentially what happened is that the national government just said, you know what, actually, we're just not even going to let the local governments decide that anymore. And I know that I personally think that will have some benefits. I think it will also have a lot of drawbacks. That'll cause a lot of problems. I mean, we often know what's best for our neighborhood, but the truth is, I think that will happen to more jurisdictions. The British Columbia government this year has set housing quotas for dozens of municipalities. They've said it is not an option, period. You have to add housing. So Oak Bay, where I live, has been declining in population. And so they demanded that Oak Bay and Victoria and Vancouver and all these other cities, West Vancouver, leafy West Vancouver, build more homes. And the end result has been that those governments no longer are listening to the upset neighbors who say, don't build a 3-story building right next or a block away from my single family home. They're listening to the provincial government, which has forced them to do it. And West Vancouver, the most affluent of all, under duress, just a few weeks ago, got rid of single family zoning and has gone for fourplexes on all lots because they were forced to. And I know that's a long roundabout way of addressing what you're saying, but we typically don't want to see the change in our own backyard. I am guilty of that, and I think all of us are. But the longer this crisis goes on, the more likely I would say all of us are to have changes imposed on us that are not comfortable. So I like, Samir, your two choices, and I hope we choose the one that you referenced.
I have to say this isn't a question, it's a comment. But actually speaking to exactly the point that you made, or you're talking about generally speaking, is the numbers of people who live in the single family homes and in neighborhoods that are all single family, resisting the change. And we saw that recently when Calgary, well, it has now changed the rules around zoning, but the majority of people who came to speak to that motion were dead set against it. They did not want their neighborhoods to change. And I'm just thinking of those of us here. I think probably a lot of us belong to organizations like community associations and churches and whatnot. I'm thinking that one of the things that we can do actually is to bring to those organizations, let's have a discussion about affordable housing with our neighbors, with our members, right? And bring this up and get the people, the grassroots, all those who live in those nice single family houses, okay, to start changing their minds and saying yes to bringing in more dense housing, the fourplexes, even the townhouses, the duplexes, all of that stuff, right? That doesn't really disrupt. And that's something I think that particularly in Calgary, from what we saw happen in the city, that's something that we can do something about as individuals and that we really need to do in order to move things along.
Thank you. Thanks for the comments.
Hi, I'm Rudy. Basically, I enjoyed your presentation. Highly complex, many issues that circulate in my mind, but I don't have the experience and the way to present it in public directly to you. So I was wondering if it would be possible to get from you address to write to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
About half a dozen at least, I can think of suggestions or ideas for your consideration.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd be happy to, Rudy. Yeah, I'll give it to you after we're all on our feet. Absolutely.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I want to know if your book will be on sale here.
I believe it will, thanks to the good folks at Owl's
That's
Nest
a
Books.
very good idea. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And thank you again to Owl's Nest Books. I don't know if they can hear me for coming. You know, it's sometimes easy to buy on Amazon, but support your local bookshops. I mean, they do so much for the community. They also do so much for writers. And just on the off chance that you didn't know, before you go and buy a book on Amazon, just go to the Owl's Nest website. You can buy all your books, even online, from your local bookshop these days.
Just to build on the point of making densification more attractive, more appealing, do you have success stories on a community turning their minds over and saying, you know what, we could actually make this really exciting and successful? Maybe there was a community that was totally opposed to it and that they changed their mind. Are there success stories that combat the fear of some of the consequences of densification? Because let's face it, you densify and then our public parks are overused or not ready when our transit system is bogged down, and we're already behind when it comes to that. So what are some ways to, with the complex problem, to make them move in concert? Have you seen stories like that?
Yes, but just to acknowledge the challenge you raised there, yeah, it absolutely taxes resources. But you know, I mean, I've talked to many city planners and urban economists who've said all growth creates problems. It overcrowds parks, not to mention schools and roads and hospitals and all the rest of it. But dollar for dollar, acre for acre, it is far more expensive to sprawl rather than densify. So, I mean, on an economic basis, that's their argument, is that densification does cost more money than doing nothing, but it is actually cheaper, especially in the long run, than just expanding. And I mean, that I'm not even getting into environmental or land issues. But to the point of successful examples, personally, I've seen lots of them. In fact, just as recently as 3 days ago, I took my youngest son, my 11-year-old son, to see, he wanted to see the first house I rented in Victoria in Vic West, which was you know, kind of a bit of a down and out neighborhood 20 years ago. As we were driving there, we saw a whole block where the developer tore not very many, I mean 8 or so decrepit old houses. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of actually quite high-end, beautiful townhomes that are also, I have to say, quite expensive. So, I mean, that's complicated. But the notion that townhomes or duplexes or fourplexes are lower class, and I use the term carefully, but it's just, I think we need to reimagine the way we think about so many things. And sorry, my son's comment was, those are nice. They're so much nicer than our house. I would move there in a second. And these are, and I've talked to the developer who did it. He said, that's all we're doing. There's no point, he said, in building single family homes anymore. The economics have decided it in Victoria. And of course, I don't speak for Calgary, but I think that's going to be the way of the future. All cities, when they, I mean, at some point there's policy and at another point there's just straight economics. So yeah, Vic West, I think, is a great example. There are many, well, there are a few in Vancouver, but that's just anecdotal. I mean, a lot of it is an intangible one. How do you answer, is life better or not? But one of the very quick things I'll add to it is that one of the arguments against it in Victoria was person after person after person said, homes are so expensive now that what you'll have are townhomes that sell for $1.2 or $1.3 million. And how does that address the affordability problem? And the answer is, immediately it doesn't. But it's one of dozens of solutions. And the fact is that, you know, young professional couples who can afford a $1.2 million home, they need a house too. And so the argument that I have been really heartened to hear agreement on from chambers of commerce and boards of trade and social housing providers and unions, all sides of the political spectrum, in agreement on is actually we just need more of everything. Deeply affordable housing, subsidized, assistance for homeless people, middle class, upper middle class, you name it. We just need more homes in most of our cities in this country now.
Thanks for your talk. I'm thinking about, lots of people up here have been talking about different paradigms and ways of thinking, and part of that frustrates me in the terms of the language that we get used to using, i.e. you said growth causes problems, growth is an opportunity, and having those kinds of paradigms influence the way we discuss with our friends, neighbors, and people who don't have the same ideas with us, and the idea that zoning is for preservation as opposed to zoning is a way to manage change that's inevitably coming, and we have an opportunity to do stuff. And then the other thing I'm thinking about is the third rail, tax policy. Our tax policy is mad. Thank you.
I really like your bringing up the word opportunity, because I actually think that's what's being denied to so many, especially young people, but across the generations. And to your point, change, growth can be opportunity. And I get it. It's in the way you look at it. I hope that will be the way we look at it, rather than just digging in our heels and saying, no, I don't want to change. I like it the way it is now, even if it's clearly not benefiting many other people.
I would like to see if you could clarify a little bit, because there seems to be kind of a confusion. We talk about quantity, so we're going to build more, so we're going to have more units for people to live in. And then we talk about affordability as if they are equal, but they are not. Calgary used to be an affordable city. The older neighborhoods are affordable. And what I mean by that is that my neighbor rents his place, his basement, 900 square feet, fully contained, fully furnished suite for $1,000 a month. A young fellow who stayed with me for 6 months lives out in the Northeast, and he rents a 600 square foot little apartment for $2,500. Yeah. Okay, now we are displacing all those old affordable places, and we are building many unaffordable places that are constantly for lease, and they're not being occupied because people cannot afford them. Yeah. Now we have displaced all the people who could afford and now cannot afford. Yeah. We're also doing something else. We are cutting down all the old canopy. We're putting in ACs and in my neighborhood, they're also building on area parks. Now, densifying and building on area parks, I don't know how does that make sense. We know that crime goes up, we know all sorts of things happen. So maybe you can explain to me the government's policy, the federal, that said, this is the quota, we're gonna give you that money, and you have to build that much. But they didn't say you have to build 20% affordable, 30% affordable. A builder came into Calgary from BC into an area where he can build 6 stories. Now he's asking for 8 stories. I said, okay, fine. You want 8 stories, you give us 1 story affordable.
Yeah, and on that last point, often it is just economics because the land costs are going higher and higher because we're all paying more and more. But to your point about people getting displaced in old buildings, it's absolutely true. The problem is, where does that lead us? Does that mean that we should just step back and do nothing? I mean, in favor of your argument, which I agree with, the road that I go to work in every morning, I ride by several people sleeping in their vans. I also ride by a brand new, purpose-built 6-story market rent apartment building. Nothing's affordable, but it's at market rates. And it was built by the company Arise, I mentioned, and this fellow Luke Murray. To build that, they tore down a 3-story, incredibly affordable 1960s apartment building, and people were displaced. So I'm agreeing with you, this happens. And the sad truth is, it's going to keep happening. And the really hard truth is that the alternative is worse, because what they did is they tripled the number of rentals. They also tried to find people affordable, and they didn't always succeed. But what I'm saying is that if we just let that paralyze us and we don't increase supply, first and foremost of affordable, subsidized apartments, then we'll be even further behind. So I know that's not a very satisfying answer. It hurts. And a lot of people are getting hurt because the fixes often cause real life hardship, even homelessness in some cases. But I think the alternative will be more homelessness and higher prices if we don't build more. Yes. I agree, and just very quickly, a number of governments are actually starting to do that. So your point's well taken. I mean, you can argue what is the acceptable amount, and that gets into horse trading about what's effective. But I mean, I agree with you, and it's why the second recommendation in my list of 37 is build more affordable, subsidized public housing.
Okay, thanks. All of this is really wonderful to hear, especially for me. I love to hear about the social housing and the co-op housing. I wonder about if you addressed retrofitting. For example, in this city, we have a lot of vacant office space downtown. So why are we tearing down these old 1950, 1960s houses? Additionally, I lived in Edmonton in an old 1969 apartment, which I really liked. But a lot of the newer ones are very thinly built. Like, they're not even that pleasant to. I'm a very sensitive person when it comes to hearing. So the quality of the house that's built, and I mean, look at the Northeast and the hail damage. There's no incentive to be putting insulation and durable siding on those. So it's actually like a retrofitted building is an affordable house.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, and also the tree canopy is no small thing. When it comes, I mean, some houses don't need air conditioning because of the tree canopy.
Yeah.
We need to pay attention to the small details.
Agreed. On your point of retrofitting rather than tearing down, I mean, I watched literally 100 feet from my house them tear down an old seniors home, which was built in 1972. And it was the strongest, most reinforced concrete building you've ever seen. My kids were transfixed over the fence watching this giant earth mover and, you know, with the big claws of death struggling to take this thing down, and they said it needed to be torn down, and I couldn't understand it. But I profile architects in Paris in the book who agree with what you just said there. You don't actually, why would you tear down a perfectly livable building? Instead, you should improve it, make it much more livable. They had this nasty old 20-story social housing block apartment building in Paris, and they built these 4 wonderful attachments which was much cheaper than tearing down and building, won a bunch of architectural awards. And what it did was, instead of apartments just having one outlook, it gave them 2 or 3, it gave them giant balconies, it gave them more space, it made it a much more desirable place to live. So you're right, quality and some of the details are off, can't be forgotten when we're focusing on quantity. Yeah, point taken.
Anyone else? You're all on a roll.
Thank you for being here and sharing some ideas. I'm just wondering, I'm left feeling that the role of family violence, right? Domestic violence, especially in a province like Alberta, there's not enough shelters, especially for women and girls, and especially our Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples who are overrepresented in these systems, looking for safety and other systemic outcomes that begin to happen as children are separated from their parents and that. And I live in Mission and often see, I'm a social worker, so people that I work alongside losing even their placements within shelters, right? And having to live out on the streets. So I think that's another important part of this big conversation, right? And especially like our Indigenous missing and murdered women coming to the city and trying to find safety, right? And finding our shelters full too. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing up the point. I mean, it's often insidious and invisible, and people are in incredibly dangerous to their very life living situations. And it is one of the factors, I know it's not the only one, is the fact that they have nowhere else to go. Whereas in a city with a higher vacancy rate and lower costs and more shelter space, as you say, they would have had options. And I've sadly, as a journalist, attended more than one coroner's inquest in British Columbia where this was highlighted as one of the points. The housing market, something as simple as the housing market, denied opportunity for women who had nowhere else to go, who might have otherwise. Thanks for bringing it up.
Anyone else?
I appreciate your comments on what I think of as the kind of the spectrum of how municipal governments are trying to implement change. And that's where one digs in the heels. This kind of discussion, it's been open, it's been exploratory, it starts to build consensus towards a type of direction, as opposed to decisions that really don't feel it's recognizing. It creates tension with municipalities when you're told this is what you're doing. And you think you're going through motions for input, et cetera, but it's very much of a tell. So maybe we've gone so far now with this problem that we have to do a tell, but I think that is what's causing all our resistance. So just your views on approaches of the how in terms of gaining consensus on this matter.
To be honest, I wish I had a cleaner answer for you, and I absolutely recognize it happens. I mean, there are so many. I don't want to call it collateral damage, but there are so many ways that individuals and renters and homeowners and communities are going to be hurt along the way by the changes that seem more and more unavoidable. So I mean, I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but I understand there are, for instance, I write in the book about housing first, the policy of putting people with severe addiction and homelessness into supportive housing units. And of course, in so many cases, that has real friction in any neighborhood where it happens. And I talk about Finland, where they've adopted this. And the short, simple solution is that they have staffed the heck out of it in the highest needs of addiction and mental health facilities. They've housed people, and in the most expensive ones, they have one social worker professional for one resident at a time. And of course, that's incredibly expensive. But the point being on that is that they have taken really drastic steps, because these things have unintended consequences. And I know this is the case in Victoria. You know, we're struggling as a city with where to put supervised consumption sites or supportive housing units. And if a person doesn't feel safe in the neighborhood because of some of the issues that go along with it, it's not really fair for me to say, oh, you're just a NIMBY. But on the other hand, all of us, all of our neighborhoods in a city need to take some role in it. So it's give and take, it's push and shove, and I feel for everybody in this. I do think we as a country are responsible for this. We let it go too far. We really did. People like me, the only investment that ever paid off in my life was my house. It's the only thing that I've really made money off of, even though I still have mortgage left. And frankly, I think too many of us just kind of let it slide. I mean, did nobody in this room ever think, you know what? Our kids are not going to be able to afford houses. The pace of growth is, the pace of real estate price escalation is not realistic. It can't continue. So I think now we're paying the price. But I think effective municipal government is, to try to get out there and listen. And I have sympathy. I hope it, it's messy. Yeah, that's my answer. It's messy.
Anyone else?
You touched on the issue of dwellings being used for Airbnb in some of the cities that are tourist attractions. And I'm sure that's an issue worldwide. Have you come across any innovative solutions to that issue?
It's really interesting. The innovation when it comes to short-term vacation rentals is all on the part, as far as I can tell, of the platforms and the landlords, who've been making money from city after city. And meanwhile, municipal governments and other governments are just like shell-shocked as the housing is disappearing. I profile in the book, I spent a chapter looking at Santa Monica, California, which of course is a big tourist destination where they've struggled. And the short answer is the innovation has actually just looked like boring bylaws and regulations and constant enforcement and spending years in the courts with Airbnb and Vrbo and so on to finally successfully, through multiple court appeals, force the companies to do a lot of the enforcement themselves, and making sure that anybody listing on Airbnb has a business license and following the strict guidelines in Santa Monica, which are that you can't rent out a whole house. So it's been trial and error. But the most memorable comment I had from somebody I talked to in Santa Monica was the mayor who had just stepped down. And he said, you know what? I'm a capitalist. He said, I believe in business and the economy and the ability for it to efficiently do things. And I think in almost everything in life, it really works. I love capitalism. But he said, being mayor and living in this attractive tourist city has made me realize housing and capitalism, at least here in Santa Monica, do not mix. And that was just such an interesting comment, I thought, from a guy who acknowledged his worldview and said in most cases, and his whole point, he said that the biggest challenge they've ever had was Airbnb and short-term rentals. It's just dominated housing discussions there because thousands of apartments have turned into de facto hotel rooms.
Thank you so much for coming to speak to us.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if you've ever interviewed Marcel Lebrun.
Marcel Lebrun?
Yeah, he's a tech multimillionaire, and he built a tiny community in Fredericton.
Oh, no. In Fredericton?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. No, I haven't. Thank you. I'll have to look him up.
Okay. And do you know Russell Bowers?
Yes.
Oh, good. You should have a cross-Canada dialogue between...
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the suggestion. Marcel Lebrun. Okay.
I think we're good. I think Brandon wants to say thank you. Thanks, everyone. Excellent questions.
Thank you for the questions and comments.
Well, thank you, Gregor. And if I can just say, having read your book, having heard your talk, the real gift to me from it is your optimism. And in the face of such a complex issue that you've studied deeply and widely, for you to come out feeling optimistic that there's hope, that leaves me feeling optimistic. And in the face of something so complex, it's easy to get discouraged, to think, to feel overwhelmed, and even to shut down. But to have hope and to have that optimism, I think, is essential if we're gonna have any meaningful impact in making change. So thank you for bringing that spirit to it and for imparting that to us. So I hope that you feel that as well. I hope you feel hopeful and optimistic and empowered that that change can happen and we can be part of it. So thank you, Gregor. Books are available in the back. Gregor will be in the Crump Room signing, and you're all welcome for a reception right through the side doors and to carry on the conversation in a more intimate face-to-face way. Can we thank Gregor one more time?